Okay, great. All right, so let me make sure we are live. It is happening. Good. Okay. Awesome. So, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, we are very excited to have you for this final event in our 8th Holocaust Education Week on the topic of immigration. We've called this week a crisis of conscience, seeking refuge, past and present. We do these education weeks in partnership with the Wassmuth Center in Boise, Idaho, and the Nathan and Esther Pelz Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So a big thank you to both of them. My name is Sophie Don. I'm the Administrative and Operations Manager for the Philadelphia Holocaust Remembrance Foundation, and we're very excited to host the event this afternoon with the Lower East Side Tenement Museum. During this presentation, we'll be hearing from Kat Lloyd, who's the Director of Education, to learn how the museum tells stories of immigration in the past through the present. So this felt really relevant to us as our own Horowitz Wasserman Holocaust Memorial Plaza in Center City, Philly, centers on a memorial to Jewish martyrs that was erected in 1964 by a group of survivors. And then 50 years later was redesigned and reopened, having added educational features and artifacts to really expand and explain the importance of the monument and the lessons that we learned from the Holocaust. So that's our mission, is to educate people on the atrocities of the past while working towards a future of tolerance and enlightenment, which is not so dissimilar to the Tenement Museum, which is sharing stories of the immigrant experience throughout history and into the present to, as their mission states, foster a society that embraces and values the role of immigration in the evolving American identity. So we're so excited to have Kat with us today to tell us more about the museum and share a story that resonates very closely with our mission and theirs. If you have any questions for Kat during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat box or to me or to Kat, and we will discuss them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Kat. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited for this.
Thank you, Sophie. Thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. And Sophie, thank you for setting up so well, right, what the Tenement Museum does, focusing on, migration, past and present, and thinking about how we can draw lessons from history for our current moment. So what we'll do in this session is look at a little bit of, where did the Tenement Museum start? What inspires our work? And then we'll take a sort of taste of a virtual tour of one of the stories that the Tenement Museum shares. So as Sophie said, I really want to hear from you throughout. Please ask your questions, comments, thoughts, whether on Zoom or on Facebook. We like things to be interactive in our Tenement Museum programs. So let's go to the Lower East Side. So here you see one of the Tenement Museum's two historic tenement buildings on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This building is 103 Orchard Street, and this was opened as a museum building in the year 2011. It's where we tell stories of more recent families who arrived in the Lower East Side in the second half of the 20th century. So today I'll share a little bit about one of the stories that we tell in that building. But the Tenement Museum, we have two buildings, and our museum began in the year 1988 in this building on the left. 97 Orchard Street. 97 Orchard Street was open as a home from 1863 to the year 1935. And today it stands as the museum's flagship building. In 1988, when the museum was founded, it was a very different building, a very different neighborhood. So here we see 97 Orchard Street on the left in the 1980s. And we see the windows are boarded up. There are some businesses on the first floor. On the right, you see one of the museum's founders, Ruth Abram. So Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson, who together, Anita was a historian, Ruth was a activist. They had a vision of a museum that was dedicated to working class lives and experiences within tenements. they go searching on the Lower East Side for a storefront that would allow them to begin a museum. And after looking at many different storefronts and not having really any luck with something that felt right, Anita found a storefront space at 97 Orchard Street, just this one right here on the first floor, which I think it says Kids for Less, right? Kids clothing store. And she goes to rent that storefront and is told that no one had lived in this building for 53 years. So Ruth and Anita realized that this building, not only the storefront could be the museum, but in fact, the whole building could be transformed into a museum. So this was a radical idea in 1988 that you could open a house museum dedicated to the stories of working class people, and in particular, working class immigrants. And Ruth and Anita really had from the very beginning, an idea that this museum would connect past to present and would not lock this museum in time, that the museum would not necessarily just tell the story of one particular group of people who called the Lower East Side home, but rather would look at stories from different time periods of people from different backgrounds who had been part of shaping the neighborhood over centuries. So we were very lucky today, those of us working at the Tenement Museum always really feel deep gratitude to our founders for having this vision that was so radical in the late 80s of a museum that explicitly connected past to present and that looked for an expansive definition of the Lower East Side and of the people who have called this neighborhood home. So pretty early in the museum's research, Ruth and Anita realized that they should tell the stories of the real people who had lived in this building instead of creating composite figures or telling generalized history. They had the possibility of really creating this power of place, that this museum could tell the stories of the specific people who called this building home from 1863 to 1935. So today, that's exactly what the museum does. We tell the stories of some of the people that you see here. All of these people lived in either 97 or 103 Orchard Street, our two historic structures, in very different time periods. In the top left, we have Harris and Jenny Levine. They were Jewish immigrants from Poland who made a home in 97 Orchard Street in the 1890s. Directly next to them is Ramonita Rivera Saez. She was a migrant from Puerto Rico, came as a US citizen to 103 Orchard Street in the 1950s. Next to her are Jane and Roger Hanrahan. Jane's parents were Irish immigrants who lived in 97 Orchard Street in the 1860s. So even in just those few photos in the top row, we see the breadth of experiences that can be studied and shared with visitors in the museum's exhibits. So through our two buildings, we have recreated apartments that tell the stories of the lives of these people. We piece together photographs and census records and marriage certificates with memoir literature and research from historians to try to paint as full a picture as possible about what it was like being new to the Lower East Side, to the United States in different time periods, and how people worked within the conditions that they experienced in tenement living, in being newcomers, really looking at what the historic record can show us about people's lives, about ordinary people's lives that help us compare to our own lives today. And that's where we really have not only this power of place in telling the specific stories of people who lived in the buildings, but of the power of personal storytelling and how we can look at oral histories and conversations to get to the complexities and the nuances of not only the past, but of our present day. And one of those complexities that we often look at is just the complexity of movement and migration. that through the different stories that we share, we don't just tell the stories of immigrants. That's certainly where the museum began, as a museum dedicated to, people who had moved from another country. But we also tell the story of the children of immigrants. Down in the lower right, we see, Josephine Baldizzi, a 9-year-old whose parents immigrated from Sicily. Right next to her is Kevin Wong, whose parents immigrated from China in the 1970s. So we tell the stories of second generation individuals. We tell the stories of migrants like Ramonita, who are arriving as US citizens. And we tell the stories of people where, their migration status isn't always so clear. And the story that I wanted to share a taste of with you today is the story of Kalman and Rivka Epstein, and their children, Bella and Blima. Kalman and Rivka arrive as displaced persons to New York City in the 1940s, before the U.S. even has this term of refugees. So it's really a very fitting story for thinking about education around the Holocaust, and thinking about how language and identity evolves over time, and how we can continually be looking to personal stories, and how each of us see our own experiences. We can be looking to those personal experiences as the historic record, right? Each of us carries within ourselves stories that are important for the historians of the future. So I'm going to pause for a moment to see if there are any questions, any connections anyone is making, before we look a little bit at the story of the Epstein family.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about this, like how you collect these stories and what that process looks like even now.
Mm. So, actually, as we move into the Epstein story, we'll get to see some video from Bella Epstein, the daughter of Kalman and Rivka, who we worked with extensively for putting together the family's exhibit in 103 Orchard Street. So, for the stories where we work with family members who are still alive, oral history and interviews are really a foundation of the museum's collection process. And then when it comes to stories of the more distant past, it's really, the detective work of putting together the pieces of records that we can find in, municipal archives, of working with genealogists to try to find descendants. When we do find descendants, trying to work with them to see what do they know about their grandparents or great grandparents or great grandparents' lives that could be part of the museum exhibit. So we're really non-traditional in the way that we didn't start with a collection of objects from which generated these stories necessarily. While actually, we can go back to this image of 97 Orchard Street. 97 Orchard Street was closed for 53 years as a home. Of course, there were a wealth of things that families left behind when they moved out in 1935. So our sort of collection that was in the building are things like there was a piece of a bagel that had been in a fireplace for who knows how long. Or clips of newspapers that had fallen through floorboard cracks, or a vial of perfume that was found in one of the apartments. So these objects that were in the building are part of the museum's collection, and give us these incredible clues into people's lives. But those objects are not on display in the museum's exhibits. What's on display are objects that are from a similar time period and that help us tell the stories of these families. And we recreate these apartments really with the help as much as possible from people who either remembered those spaces or from people who wrote about tenement life in the past. So our collection process is really varied, and looks different depending on the time period that we are trying to work with for our exhibit, and the participation of descendants of the families that we're talking about. So really good question, and really brings us nicely into the Epstein family story. Um, so the Epsteins, they lived in this tenement building right here, 103 Orchard Street, starting in the 1950s. But they arrive in the late 1940s, and we get to know their story through the story of their daughter, Bella Epstein. She visits this building again with the museum after about 50 years away. She lived here as a young girl, and when the museum first contacted her, she was generous enough to come visit the Lower East Side, take us through her childhood home, and help us recreate it. So that's where we'll sort of move into a taste of a sort of virtual tour of one of the Tenement Museum's exhibits, coming into 103 Orchard Street, looking at this hallway space. Here we see Bella and Belima, the sisters in this family, holding hands out on the street right next to their family's apartment building. And then this stairway, which Bella had very vivid memories of. The building, when she lives here, is really diverse. She and her parents and her sister are living within a Lower East Side that is racially and culturally diverse. So she remembers walking up these stairs and hearing Yiddish, her parents' home language, hearing Spanish, hearing Chinese coming from her neighbors' apartments, and that this hallway was really where you in a way, got to know your neighbors. So she, when she's visiting the building in 2014, taking us through the space, has sort of this flood of memories that are coming back to her. So this is just one example of how a space, or like the hallway, or an object, can really be an anchor and a spark for memories. And moving into the apartment itself, this is the hallway that leads to the apartment where Bella and her family lived. This tenement building is a little different. We see here in front of us apartment 8. There were about 15 apartments in the building where Bella lived with her parents, but the apartments, they were pretty big for tenement apartments, about 900 square feet, and there are only 15 apartments in the whole building, compared to some other tenements that have 20, 25 apartments. So this is a very unique building, and with its uniqueness are some of the sort of features that were in the building that Bella remembered. And one of those features was actually the mezuzah that her parents had put up on the door frame of their apartment. So here we see the door to apartment 7, where Bella lived with her parents starting in 1954. And on the right here, we see the mezuzah, the Jewish prayer scroll. And we were lucky enough to have Bella share with us the story of this mezuzah directly. So I'll play a video where you'll see Bella today just sharing a little bit about what that meant for her and how she connected it to her parents' experiences.
This is my apartment. I can't believe it. This is where you looked to see if a stranger, my parents always told me, always look here, never open up the door unless you're sure you know who it is. This could be the mezuzah that we had put up, because we never lived without a mezuzah to protect us, which was brave of my parents, considering that they'd always been persecuted because they were Jewish. And no matter what, I always put a mezuzah up in my house, wherever I live, on every room. Wow.
So this mezuzah really becomes this entryway for Bella's memories about her parents and their experiences arriving to New York City as Holocaust survivors. And as Bella, notes sort of being brave to put up this mezuzah on their doorframe. And she talks too about the mezuzah as in a way a symbol of her parents' faith in the United States as a place where they could put up a mezuzah like that. which, I think that memory from Bella and the way that she sees this mezuzah as a symbol of faith and of bravery really also points to the context in which the Epsteins are arriving in New York City and in which they're, arriving as Holocaust survivors. So we'll go into the apartment and talk a little bit more about Kalman and Rivka before sharing a bit more about Bella. So we enter into the sort of front door of the apartment. We see there's this sort of pale blue paint, almost robin's egg blue on the walls. Again, this is a big apartment, and Bella said that her parents specifically wanted to move into this apartment because it was bigger than some of the other places they lived on the Lower East Side. So they would have had 2 bedrooms. We see this dining room directly ahead of us. There was a kitchen, a living room, and a bathroom inside the apartment, which not every apartment had at this point in this building. So we see a bathroom painted pink with decorative curtains. There is sort of this closet space in the hallway where the museum has recreated sort of the way that Bella remembered the telephone, the rotary phone on the desk, and the way that her parents would have decorated the space. So coming into this dining room, I mean, here we see the table set with 4 chairs, one for each member of the family. It was mom and dad, Kalman and Rivka, and then Bella and Blima were both born in New York City. So they're a mixed status family, right? Mom and dad are immigrants. The kids are born here. And, Kalman and Rivka, they are coming to the United States, at this period of many, displaced persons, Holocaust survivors arriving in the U.S. Here we see their photo where Bella has written beneath mom, hearts dad. And the museum was able to find actually Kalman and Rivka's declarations of intent to become citizens. These were filed just a little after they arrive in 1947. These are their paperwork to file to become, naturalized. And they would have help filing this paperwork. Kalman and Rivka both were sponsored to arrive in the United States by the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which I know, is connected to the programming that you're doing this week. So the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society sponsors Kalman and Rivka, as do family. Kalman has an aunt and uncle who are in New York City who help with the sponsorship for them arriving. And, their arrival is actually part of, this much larger immigration system at the time. Probably many of you are familiar, but in 1924, the United States puts in place a very restrictive immigration law, a quota system that drastically reduces the number of official visas that are issued to immigrants from certain countries, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe. So this is a law based on ideas about racial identity at the time, specifically meant to exclude certain people from the country. And people like Kalman and Rivka, right, were then essentially stuck when the war breaks out and people are looking to flee, that the United States is not, welcoming immigrants from places like Poland, where both Kalman and Rivka were born. So it's not until sort of the end of World War II and an executive order that President Truman issues that we have essentially an adjustment of this quota system to allow all of the visas under the quota to go to the language at the time was displaced persons. So Kalman and Rivka, they enter because of the executive order that Truman issues in 1945 that allots 23,000 visas for displaced persons. And you can see, if we scroll in a little bit, that it lists here that Kalman is born in Breslau, Germany. That's actually incorrect. He was from Kielce, Poland. And we think that this designation here is because there were more visas for people from Germany than there were for people from Poland. We don't know who told him to put this on the document, but it's a way that people were essentially getting around the limited number of visas for people from Poland. So, we have this context of, displaced persons like Kalman and Rivka who had survived the Holocaust, who were looking to start a new life, coming to the United States at this period. Um, and we didn't get to meet Kalman or Rivka, so we're hearing their stories through their daughter Bella, and her experiences growing up in this apartment. So, she hadn't seen these documents before, actually. So one of the things the museum always values is when we can connect descendants to some of the historic records to explore their family story more deeply. And it's those records that then become ways to have conversations about these people's experiences in ways that we don't always think about our family story. So here, we see a table set for, lighting Sabbath candles, just in a couple of hours, right? Rivka would have been lighting these candles, saying prayers after preparing the Sabbath meal. And, we can see a better view of this table here. For Sabbath dinner, the Epsteins would probably have over family. This is Jacob and Golda Epstein, Kalman's aunt and uncle. They were the sponsors for Kalman and Rivka, really helped them get settled, enrolled them in English classes through the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, put them up in their apartment when the Epsteins first arrive, and in many ways help Kalman and Rivka navigate, not only the Lower East Side, but the United States. The Lower East Side had had many decades of Jewish infrastructure by this period. So synagogues and Yiddish newspapers and kosher restaurants would have been really still present in the neighborhood by the 1940s. But Jacob and Golda are part of this earlier wave of Jewish immigrants who arrive in the neighborhood. They immigrate in 1913. So, they have 3 decades of experience with life in the US, with thinking about sort of how to be Jewish in the United States. And, Golda, we see here, she may have been the one teaching Rivka how to cook the cholent or stew for the Sabbath dinner. Rivka was a teenager when World War II broke out. And so when she's imprisoned in a concentration camp, she doesn't have a chance to learn to cook from her own mother. And so maybe it's Golda who's teaching Rivka how to, cook the stew for the Sabbath meal every week. Now, something that Golda and Jacob can't teach Kalman and Rivka about is how to be a parent, particularly how to be a parent after having survived what Kalman and Rivka survived. Golda and Jacob don't have any children of their own. And in thinking about, raising Bella and Blima, I really think about Kalman and Rivka trying to navigate their own trauma and the newness of New York City and what helps them find stability and find comfort within life in New York as they're beginning again. And, it is, this Sabbath ritual perhaps that brings some of this comfort and stability. Bella told us that, here we see her out on the sidewalk, this big grin on her face. She told us that even when she'd gone out to play on a, Friday afternoon, that of course her mother, required her to be home for Sabbath dinner every Friday night. So that the Sabbath on the Friday evening was a really deeply important part of the family's life in this apartment. And that, we can imagine the family sitting down to dinner, maybe Jacob and Golda come over, and thinking about what are the conversations around the table. Are they speaking in Yiddish? Perhaps the adults are. Maybe Bella and her sister are chatting in English. Bella said, of course, her parents were always more comfortable in Yiddish, but that she and her sister eventually start talking to each other in English. These are the just some of the ways in which Bella is starting to think about herself as a young Jewish girl growing up in a Jewish home, but in a neighborhood that's really, again, full of these other influences from, the neighborhood around her and of sort of pop culture at the time period. So I'll pause for a moment again to see if there are any questions or connections that have come up from anyone. Uh,
We do have a couple questions based on some of the things that you just brought up. So I have a couple. Do you want me to
Go
ask them
for
all?
it. Go
at once,
for
or-
it.
Okay. So the two are, you mentioned the objects in the home aren't original, but are based on what you know of the time and what the oral histories are recalling. So the question there is, how do you source those objects? Where are they coming from?
Mhm.
And then the other question is, how much of the research is done by the descendants? So like mentioning that those documents, the visa documents, were found by the Tenement Museum in doing research. How much do you find is the descendants versus the work of the museum, finding things that are, uncovering things that the descendants maybe don't know?
Good question. So first, for the objects, we have a wonderful furnishings director who's worked with the museum since the late 80s, Pam Keach, and um, she talks about in the 1980s and early 90s, she travels to flea markets and antique shows trying to find these objects. And then she talks about for this exhibit where, she is working in, this would have been probably 2015 and 2016, just how much easier it is to find things using eBay and the power of the internet. So we were able to ask, she could ask Bella, okay, what kind of candlesticks did your parents have? Or, what color was your bedspread, for example? We'll look at the children's bedroom in a minute. And then she could go to eBay and find something that's that exact color. And it's amazing because now, of course, we can text Bella and just ask her that, which, of course, when we're recreating an apartment from the 1860s or 1880s, we have to go on different types of sources. So there's a wide range of sources. A lot of it is serendipity. A lot of it is also just Pamela Keach searching eBay to find things that match with the memories that we have from former residents. And then the other question about sort of how do we share the work between descendants and the museum, I'd say more often than not for the earlier families that we talk about, um, the descendants tend to have photographs and some family stories that have been passed down through generations, but not as often documents. So it's usually kind of the museum connecting the descendants with documents or what the genealogists have found, and connecting those to the photographs and sort of stories that family members often provide, which I think just brings up a really interesting question of what kinds of stories do we all know from our families, who has family stories that are passed down, who doesn't, and why, what stories are passed down when stories are passed down, and why. And essentially, looking at, why do we know what we know about our families? There's just some really essential questions about, family identity and history over generations that we can open up through these conversations and tours. So in some cases, the descendants have said, I know nothing about my ancestors. But of course, in cases like Bella's, or for this exhibit, we talked to other families from the same time period, and they, have an immense wealth of memories to share with us about their parents.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Go for it. Great.
And I was able to visit the museum a few years ago. I loved being in the space. It's such a unique experience of walking through the museum and really feeling like you're in somebody's apartment. But I'm curious for anybody who's watching who hasn't been there, we are able to see, walking through with you, we're watching these clips of videos, and there are these artifacts that are in places. When somebody's walking through, how are they getting, are you walking through with like an iPad now, or is it the docent? Can you just tell us a little bit about how that experience works?
Sure. So the visit to the Tenant Museum is a guided tour. So we really champion storytelling, and because of that, we have tour guides. We call our tour guides educators. So an educator takes you through these apartments and shares the story with you of the family, while you're also able to look at the documents and photographs. So it's really a very human experience, and it's really important to the museum. It was really important to Ruth and Anita, the founders, that people be telling these stories, because these are stories about people. So we're not a museum with wall text or sort of a self-guided experience. It's really thinking about, what can happen? What is that power of, personal storytelling? And having a guide to bring you through that space. And certainly we see that brings up possibilities of connections and people sharing connections, because you're in a group of people where you're able to share connections with each other and hear similarities and differences between your own experiences and the experience of the family that you're hearing about in the museum exhibit. And actually, one of the spaces that sparks so many connections is this bedroom space that Bella shared with her sister Blima. So here we see they have two twin beds. This is where our furnishings director was able to find a pink bedspread and a blue bedspread, according to Bella's memories, and recreate the space. And Bella had told us too that her mother would always paint the walls colors that were Freilach, which means joyful in Yiddish. So we see sort of the inspiration for some of the pinks and blues that we have in the apartment now. But this space often really sparks memories around the objects, and visitors recalling, for people who lived through this time period of the 1950s, 1960s, recalling objects that are similar in their own experiences. And one of those objects is by far this record player here. So we have the desk that Bella and her sister would use to do their homework. They both went to Jewish day school in the neighborhood. But Bella told us that her father bought a record player for $50. He was one of the first families in the building to have one, and that she got her mother to buy her a very particular record. So I'm going to let Bella share this story about the music in this home.
My father bought a record player that he used to play Yossel Rosenblatt albums on. And he would say, oh, Ashtima, Ashtima, that means a voice, what a voice he has, what a voice he has. And then when my father wasn't using the record player, I had gotten my mother to buy me a record, and it was Paul Anka. Oh, please stay by me, Diana. I'm so young and you're so old. That was the song. I mean, that was it. That made me an American. Just what they say, 'cause forever I will pray.
I never get tired of hearing that story. And I think actually this room is still the place where this song is played more than anywhere else in the world. So, we see Bella's memory of this record and this song, and she says that this not only makes her feel American, I mean, she says it makes her an American. And this really always brings up this question of why, right? Why is it this record that makes her feel American? And, what aspects of her experience were making her feel like she wasn't American before that? And, we can really then open it up a conversation during a tour about, what has made us feel like we belong for each of us, whether we have connections to migration or not. How, perhaps we've all had that experience of feeling like we do or do not belong. And within Bella's story, we can really see the role of pop culture and music as this entry point into feeling a wider American identity at a time when, yes, there are a lot of Jewish you know children that she's growing up around, but also a time when she's watching TV. Her dad also bought a TV, also one of the first families in the building to buy a TV. But she's watching the sitcoms of the time and seeing blonde haired, blue eyed families in the suburbs, that are definitely not her family's experience living in a city as a Jewish family with parents who are essentially refugees. Um, Even at, this is such a complicated time period too, because, this neighborhood in its diversity is a real window into exploring this idea of belonging and how racial identity has shaped belonging over time. We see these are the data of how the neighborhood changed from 1950 to 1960 when the Epsteins are here. Through the Great Migration of African Americans fleeing racial violence in the South, the Black population increases in the neighborhood from 1950 to 1960 from 3% to 7%. The Puerto Rican population in the neighborhood also increases as Puerto Ricans are moving to New York for other opportunities. And white ethnic families are moving away from the Lower East Side in this period as the suburbs are opening up and those opportunities are there for them. So, this neighborhood really is really racially diverse compared to other neighborhoods in Manhattan at the time. And, Bella's memories give us a window into, the ideas of belonging and Americanness. She has a friend, Rosetta de Benedetto, whose parents are Italian. Rosetta used to call out the window to Bella to, here we see the window, right? Rosetta would yell out to Bella through the air shaft to come over to play. But Bella, she would go over to, Rosetta's house for dinner, but she couldn't actually eat the food because a lot of it had pork in it and wasn't kosher. Bella also had a friend, Barbara, who was African American, whose family, most likely, although we don't know for sure, moved to New York from the South. We see ideas about how, kids are experiencing, what they perceive to be the ideas about who is welcome, who is not, who is accepted, who is not, and how that manifests in some of their memories. Right, Bella remembering that Rosetta's parents didn't want to invite her parents over to dinner because they were Jewish. And we think that the children's perspectives are always so important to these stories, to thinking about how are they understanding their worlds, and how are they understanding the experiences of their parents. So the museum is always looking to connect these stories, more fully to the present. And one of the ways that we do that is through a project that we have called Your Story, Our Story. Oop, I forgot I had this photo. Here's this amazing photo of all the families who are featured in this exhibit. This is Bella with her children and her grandchildren today. On the right are Jose and Migdalia Velez, whose story we tell in the same exhibit. And then Mrs. Wong and Yat Ping Wong. So all three of these families are represented within the exhibit that I shared a bit with you today. But the idea of connecting to the present, I mean, is not only through the multiple generations within the descendant stories, so that Bella can share with her grandchildren how this apartment provided a place for her family to shape a new life in the United States. But the museum has a project called Your Story, Our Story that invites anyone to contribute a story about their cultural identity, told through an object or a tradition. And it's a website, so it can hold as many stories as people who submit. So here you see a collage of some of the stories that people have contributed, of a fur coat you see up in the top left that someone brought when she fled Syria for New York, or a Christmas card right next to that, which someone of Chinese heritage shared that her, friend had given her when she first moved to the United States. So these stories in Your Story, Our Story are a different form of collecting that the museum uses. So there was the question earlier about how does the museum collect stories to display in our exhibits. This Your Story, Our Story project is not displayed in our physical buildings. It's a website, but it's a way for us to really show that everyone, each of us, has a story to share. We have objects in our lives, we have traditions in our lives that can tell us things about who we are, where we've come from. That are deserving of being in a museum. And, those stories can get us to migration, and they can get us to, cultural identity, to ideas about belonging. So we really use these stories, and find inspiration in these stories for conversations about the past and the present. So I invite you all definitely to look at this exhibit and see how you might use it in whether you're a teacher using tools with your students. We have many classrooms who contribute to this project, but it's also a really powerful tool within families to look at what represents our family, parts of our family story, what has been lost over time, what has been passed down, and how do the stories that we've been you know that we've inherited from our family, how can we question those and sort of learn where those have come from, right? Often we hear from people when thinking about contributing to this project, I don't know things about my family history. And certainly for many people living in the country, right, there's structural reasons for that, whether it's through legacies of enslavement or racism and xenophobia that have, meant that certain stories were erased or prevented from being passed down, but also just the reasons that people might not want to pass down certain stories of their lives. So Your Story, Our Story really opens a window to see how we can all have conversations with people who are close to us, with our family members, to open up deeper conversations about who we are, not only as a family but as a country. So that really always makes me think too back to Bella, and just she talks about her parents not sharing stories of the past with her, and not wanting to talk about the Holocaust and what they had experienced. And it's really through this exhibit that Bella, was then really thinking through again for the first time in many decades, how the the experiences of her parents shaped her own experience as a Jewish woman. So, these are the many questions that we look at the museum, and just the ways to expand understanding of our current moment by looking at the past. I see a good question from Esther about, in today's polarized world where immigration is such a hot topic, how does the museum stay apolitical and support dialogue across the aisles? So, I think we've thought about this a lot, of course, certainly, and during the past presidential administration, and how politicized immigration was in that moment. I think what we often offer is a place to get historic context to see that immigration has actually always been political. So while the museum is not political with a capital P per se, and that we don't support any particular candidates for any offices, we are lowercase p political in that immigration and migration have always been political in the United States. There's never a period, in fact, in our country's history where immigration was not debated, where there weren't people who were really against immigration or really passionately for immigration. So we can often use that historic context to look at, okay, these are the things that we hear today, that people are saying about immigrants within the United States. What were people saying in the past? Where do those perspectives come from? So we do try to support dialogue by not only using the historic context, but also looking at the methods of conversation and facilitation, and really inviting people to reflect on how they've come to hold the beliefs that they hold about migration or American identity. But also really being, very clear that, that, for example, racism has always been a part of the ways that particularly the United States government has shaped immigration policy, or being really clear that certain immigrant groups have had advantages compared to others. So there are moments where we do really have to acknowledge that the museum does have a foundation and a perspective as a museum, but also that the museum can be a place where you can have conversations about things that you know often when you discuss them with strangers, it does lead to lack of understanding, right? A museum tour, and particularly entering through personal story, can be a very different place than, for example, a Facebook comment thread, or even a classroom where all the students are the same age. A museum tour where you have people of different generations, of different backgrounds, can really be a very, very powerful staging ground for opening up conversations, and we hope deepened understanding about how we've all come to hold the beliefs that we hold, and how we can revisit what we think we know about about our world today, or about where we've come from. I see another really good question. What would you like students to leave with? Oh, hmm. I always hope that people leave with a sense of curiosity. I think more than anything, that fostering a sense of curiosity about the past, about their own communities, about their own lives, their experiences. So curiosity. And then I think the second thing that I always hope students leave with is understanding that their stories deserve to be in a museum. That the stories in museums don't have to just be the stories of the wealthy or the privileged or the sort of dominant culture, that each of us has stories and objects and parts of our experiences that should be in museum exhibits. So yeah, really, really critical questions for sort of what we hope students, and really people of all ages, right? We're all learners on a journey. What we hope people kind of take with them after their museum visit. So seeing another question as well, that there is some interest in your story, our story, and sort of, are we seeing people sharing more recent personal experiences? Yes, I mean, it's been interesting in the virtual. We've been doing virtual tours for the last year and a bit, and in the virtual tours, there really is a little bit more space, through using the chat in Zoom, where we host our tours, for people to share personal experiences, and we do see that. People are willing and generous and trusting of the museum, to share parts of their stories with us. And it depends. Some people share things of more distant family history. Some people share things of more recent family history, and that depends, I think, on the story that we're grounding in. Whether it's the Epsteins, people might share more recent experiences. If we're looking at more distant history, maybe people share about their ancestors. So we really hope for both the museum tours and the Your Story, Our Story project to be generative, and to provide people opportunities to share about their identities, and what's shaped their identities from kind of whatever perspective they would like, whether that's their own experience or that of an ancestor.
I have another question, but I'm just going to unmute myself.
Absolutely.
Thank you. For folks who might be interested in kind of digging into their own family histories, do you have any, recommendations for people who are just starting on that journey of trying to uncover, these documents, or, just to learn more and have more evidence, in looking at their own histories? Do you have any recommendations for how somebody could get into that, like ancestry.com, or
Hmm.
I don't know what else?
Yes, all of it. Well, so yes, I mean, I think more and more records are being digitized every day. And actually, the pandemic has been a really interesting period for archives being digitized, because people are working to digitize things that they'd been meaning to digitize for ages. So there's really more appearing on sites like ancestry.com or familysearch.org that really can provide a range of different types of public records. Um, Depending on where you're located, municipal archives in New York City, there's a pretty robust municipal archives, and certainly, I think seeking like more local records can often be really helpful. And I know, there's a lot of work going on right now too around, Black and African American genealogy and Indigenous genealogy, looking at sort of whose stories have historically been erased from the historic record. So there's a lot of historians and archivists who are working to kind of read between the lines of historic sources and try to see, okay, how can we understand the experiences of enslaved people, for example, or displaced Indigenous people in the past from looking at something like a census record. So it's a really, really excellent moment to be starting the work in researching in archives, whether that's, for learning about your own family's experience or for another purpose. This is a really, really interesting moment to be doing that. But definitely ancestry.com, familysearch.org is another good one. And sort of the records of whatever municipality either you or your family are in. Any other questions out there from anyone? Well, I do want to share how you can stay in touch with the museum. If you were not familiar with us before this, I really do encourage you to visit our website. You could scan this QR code, which will take you to our website, or you can find information on the museum. We're hosting weekly virtual tours right now of the Epstein family story, of other family stories from our other building. We have book talks every month. And, we also have an online bookstore where you can see some of the books that we've used to put together the research for the Epstein family story and others. So we hope you'll stay in touch with the museum. Come see us again. And thank you so much for joining for this program today. And thank you to Sophie, Leslie, Sam for hosting this program.
Thank you so much, Kat. This was phenomenal. Such a great, background on the museum, and really great virtual tour. You really do, and nothing can replace being at the museum and that feeling of being in that space. But really cool to see how the walkthrough does work virtually, and being able to watch those videos and see those other artifacts is really interesting. But I do highly, highly recommend that if anybody finds themselves in New York, or, should go to New York, because we should all be visiting New York, to definitely visit the museum. And I just wanted to, I think, emphasize something that you had already said, but this generative nature of the tours, and how when I went through, it was with a class that I was taking, the number of people that were just offering up these little bits of information from their own family histories that were wildly different experiences, coming from different countries and at very different times, but having this kind of common experience of what it's like to be in the United States as an immigrant, and it was really amazing. And I think it
Mm.
really did create some fabulous new connections that I had no idea could exist.
It's like the
And
best compliment we could get, that people are learning things about each other and not just about the past.
yeah,
So thank
it
you.
was
Come visit us in New
phenomenal.
York. We just reopened in our buildings today. It's May 7th for those of you who are watching later. So we are reopened in our buildings for very small tours. We have walking tours of the neighborhood. So if you do make it to New York sometime, please come visit us in person.
Thank you so much. And thank you for watching, folks who are watching this. And have a great afternoon and wonderful and safe weekend.
Thank you all. Take care.
Bye-bye.